Mark Twain lived in Buffalo for only 18 months, from August of 1869 to March of 1871. Twain's life in Buffalo ended with illness, loss, and anxiety, but it began on a high note. He moved to Buffalo as a bachelor and the new editor of the Buffalo Express. His wealthy future father-in-law, coal magnate Jervis Langdon, put up $25,000 to make him part owner. Twain threw himself into his work at the Express with the enthusiasm approaching glee, transforming the newspaper with wit and elan. He had a wide social circle. He had just published The Innocents Abroad. Everybody loved him and wanted to get close to him. He was like a rock star. 6 months after arriving in Buffalo, Twain married Olivia Langdon, and they moved into a mansion purchased as a surprise wedding gift by her father. Twain and his new wife hosted visitors and socialized. It was also a productive period for Twain personally, who not only wrote for, edited, and made changes at the Express for the first 6 weeks, but began work on Roughing It. Soon Olivia became pregnant, but was devastated when her father was diagnosed with stomach cancer and died on August 6th of 1870. Then Emma Nye, a dear friend of Olivia's who was visiting, was stricken with typhoid fever and died in their home September 29th. Finally, their son Langdon was born prematurely November 7th, frail and sickly, and Olivia fell ill with typhoid herself. They'd had enough. Olivia was carried out of their home on a mattress to the train station for the trip to Elmira. Both the home and Twain's stake in the Express were sold at a loss. For the last 8 months, with hardly an interval, I've had from my fellows and comrades, night and day, doctors and watchers of the sick. During these 8 months, death has taken 2 members of my home circle and malignantly threatened 2 others. All this I have experienced, yet all the time have been under contract to furnish humorous matter once a month for this magazine. To be a pirate on a low salary and with no share of the profits in the business used to be my idea of an uncomfortable occupation. But I have other views now. To be a monthly humorist in a cheerless time is drearier. 1851 was a big year for Dunkirk, New York. The New York and Erie Railroad was completed, the last tie being laid in April. The railroad was opened on May 14th when a train made half of the journey from the Hudson River to Dunkirk. Continuing the next day, the train arrived in Dunkirk with Charles Sherman, a Dunkirk resident, as engineer for the second half of the trip. The railroad was 445 1/2 miles long with wide gauge tracks, 6 feet in width. This was the longest railroad then in existence and the first from the Atlantic Ocean to the Great Lakes. Many notables made the trip, including President Fillmore and his cabinet, Daniel Webster, Seward, and Douglas, etc. The entire railroad project had cost $23,500,000, and great predictions were made for the development of the country along its route. Passenger and freight service on a regular basis started May 19th. Later in the year, the telegraphic system of dispatching trains was adopted. The train was in 2 sections with a total of 12 cars. Fireworks and bonfires added to the festivities. Several railroads were in existence, namely the Baltimore and Ohio, the Camden and Amboy, the Mohawk and Hudson, a branch of the Delaware and Hudson, and others, all of them much shorter than the New York and Erie. This railway is the result of consolidations of several smaller railways that have gone broke or been taken over. One of the first in this region is the Franklin Canal Company. Chartered in 1844, the Franklin Canal Company built the original line from Erie, Pennsylvania to the Pennsylvania-Ohio state border. The Cleveland, Painesville, and Ashtabula Railroad, incorporated in 1848, laid the track from Cleveland, Ohio to the Ohio-Pennsylvania state border, meeting up with the Franklin Canal Company line. The full line from Cleveland to Erie was first opened for passengers November 20th, 1852. In 1854, the Cleveland, Painesville, and Ashtabula bought out the Franklin Canal Company. The Buffalo and State Line Railroad, incorporated in 1849, built the line from Dunkirk, New York, to the New York, Pennsylvania state line. It opened January 1, 1852, and the full line to Buffalo opened February 22nd, 1852. The final short segment, built by the Erie and Northeast Railroad, from the New York state line to Erie, Pennsylvania, also opened in January of 1852. This line was different, however. It was built with a wide-gauge, 6-foot tracks favored by the New York and Erie Railway. The majority of the line from Buffalo to Cleveland was 4-foot 10-inch track. November 16th, 1853, the Buffalo and State Line Railroad and the Erie and Northeast Railroad made an agreement. They would relay the track at the standard gauge, and the Buffalo and State Line would operate the line. Passengers and freight would no longer need to change trains at Erie, Pennsylvania. This situation had provided a nice profit to Erie, particularly to freight handlers and food vendors, catering to the delayed passengers. They would be cut off. December 7th, 1853, the Erie Gauge War began. After swearing in 150 special police constables, Mayor Alfred King led the police to the railroad bridge crossing State and French streets, and where engineers had marked the edges of the streets on the bridges, had sections of the bridges cut out. That evening, 7 miles away in the town of Harbor Creek, its citizens decided to pass its own ordinances and proceeded to tear up tracks along the highway. 3 days later, tracks of the new gauge were completed up to the city limits, and that night the people of Harbor Creek tore out the tracks again, knocked down a bridge, and even plowed up a level crossing. An injunction was obtained by the railroad from the United States Circuit Court in Pittsburgh, and a United States Marshal was dispatched to Harbor Creek. Upon arriving in Harbor Creek, the Marshal served it on one of the officials of Harbor Creek and pointed out the seal of the United States.
The official promptly threw it on the ground and stomped it with his heel, and declared the heel mark the seal of Harbor Creek. Sam had lectured in Erie, Pennsylvania in 1871. The Erie Observer didn't much like him and described the show as a decided failure and a pitiful attempt to ape the style of Artemus Ward, in which he only succeeded in reaching the standard of a Negro minstrel. Twain considered Artemus Ward as perhaps America's greatest humorist. Just previous to the Erie show, on November 21st of 1871, at the Plymouth Church in Brooklyn, he spoke of Ward. The Brooklyn Daily Eagle thought highly of his efforts. On the whole, the lecture, which was actually nothing but a discursive and pleasant bundle of stories, bound together by a cord of quaint fancy, heartily pleased the audience, who frequently testified by their applause and their laughter the satisfaction he had occasioned. The most serious incident occurred on December 27th, 1853, when a train of railroad officials and workers was stopped outside of Harbor Creek by a crowd of people ripping up the tracks. An official shot at one of the men in the crowd and knocked him unconscious. The crowd, who believed the man to be dead, chased the official back onto his train. After 2 or 3 members of the crowd forced their way on the train reversed and headed at full speed for the state line. Once across the border, the train stopped, and stowaways from Harbor Creek were sent back over the border into Pennsylvania. On December 26, 1853, Horace Greeley, editor of the New York Tribune, had to travel through Erie on his way to Chicago, and had to travel from Harbor Creek to Erie in an open sleigh through a cutting storm of wind, snow, and sleet. Greeley had hoped to be able to give a lecture in Adrian, Michigan, that same day, but that could not now be, for the kingdom of Erie forbade it. Let Erie be avoided by all travelers until grass shall grow in her streets, until her piemen in despair shall move away to some other city. Horace Greeley, New York Tribune. Connaught, an Iroquois word that probably does not mean river of many fish or snow water. Possibly it derives from a word for standing stone, or stone at the bottom of water, or maybe even it is a long time since they are gone. I think most people in the area will probably continue to think of it as a river of many fish. Finally, on February 1st, 1854, the railroad ran a train through Erie without change, but civil disturbances continued as late as 1856, and the matter had caused such hard feelings that people avoided discussing it for years afterwards, in order to avoid starting arguments. The Ashtabula River Railroad disaster. The Lakeshore and Michigan Southern Railway train number 5, the Pacific Express, left Erie, Pennsylvania on the afternoon of December 29th, 1876, in deep snow. 2 locomotives, Socrates and Columbia, were hauling 11 rail cars, including 2 express cars, 2 baggage cars, 1 smoking car, 3 coaches, and 3 sleeping cars that carried 159 passengers. At about 7:30 p.m., the train was crossing over the Ashtabula River, about 1,000 feet from the railway station at Ashtabula, Ohio, when the bridge gave way beneath it. The lead locomotive made it across the bridge, while the second locomotive and the rest of the train plunged 76 feet into the water. Some cars landed in an upright position. The wooden cars were set alight by the heating stoves and lamps, and soon small localized fires became an inferno. Of the 159 passengers and crew on board that night, 92 were killed or died later from injuries. They included the gospel singer and hymn writer Philip Bliss and his wife. 48 of the fatalities were unrecognizable or consumed in the flames. 64 people were injured. The crash was heard in the town, and the alarm was raised. By the time the townspeople reached the bridge, the wounded passengers had made their way to the shore, and the fire was burning fiercely. When the Ashtabula Fire Brigade arrived, the immediate instructions from railroad employees were to get the wounded out and to clear a pathway up the side of the ravine. After this, no water was put onto the fire, even after reports of survivors still trapped in the wreck. The survivors were led, carried, and conveyed on sleds to hotels and private houses in the town, there being no hospital. However, people assisting also stole money and valuables from the survivors and dead. $1,500 being returned following investigation by detectives and after the mayor had made a proclamation. The dead were moved the following morning. The railroad bridge was rebuilt with temporary underpinning. The following day, an investigative coroner's jury made up of 6 men was appointed. Their investigation was to take 68 days. The Ashtabula bridge designer, Amasa Stone, who had been president of the railroad company that had built the bridge, had taken a well-established wooden bridge pattern, the Howe Truss, and adapted it as the pattern for an all-iron bridge. Built in 1865 to span 165 feet, the engineer employed to draft and construct it resigned after saying the braces were too small. The railroad's engineer in charge, Charles Collins, saw it as an experiment, leaving matters to the president. The coroner's jury report strongly criticized the design of the bridge, as the failure of one part led to its collapse. Bridge members, instead of being fastened, rested on each other. The report also noted that an inspection by a competent bridge engineer during the 11 years the railroad had used the bridge would have spotted these defects. The jury also criticized the way the trains had been heated and censured the Ashtabula chief fireman for failing to attempt to put out the fire. The state legislature of Ohio appointed engineers to look at the use of iron for the bridge, then a new material, and they concluded that the material had no inherent defect. Days after testifying to the state legislature committee, Collins was found dead in his bedroom of a gunshot wound to the head. Having tendered his resignation to the board of directors the previous Monday and been refused, Collins was believed to have committed suicide out of grief and feeling partially responsible for the tragic accident. However, a police report at the time suggested the wound had not been self-inflicted. Amasa Stone committed suicide 7 years later. The morning of Monday, July 15th, 1895, the Clemenses arrive in Cleveland, Ohio. This is from Major James Pond's book, The Eccentricities of Genius. At the Stillman with Mark Twain, his wife, and their daughter Clara. Mark looks badly fatigued. We have very comfortable quarters here. Mark went immediately to bed upon our arrival. He is nervous and weak. Reporters from all the morning and evening papers called and interviewed him. It seemed like old times again, and Mark enjoyed it. The young men called at 3 p.m. and paid me the fee for the lecture, which took place in Music Hall. There were 4,200 people present, at prices ranging from 25 cents to $1. It was 9 o'clock before the crowd could get in and Mark began. As he hobbled upon the stage, there was a grand ovation of cheers and applause, which continued for some time. Then he began to speak, and before he could finish a sentence, the applause broke out again. So it went on for over an hour on a mid-July night, with the mercury trying to climb out of the top of the thermometer. Mark Twain kept that vast throng in convulsions.